It is now my great pleasure to enjoy Fabio Segura, who I've met, it must be like 12 years ago at least. And so it's a huge pleasure and an honor to have you here today, Fabio, to discuss really what the purpose of business is and what impact finance is all about. Leading up to the session we'll have in about 1 hour with Mohammed Yunus that we're all looking forward to. If we're talking about impact business, purpose-oriented business, who better to talk to than a purpose-driven leader, which clearly Fabio you are. Fabio is currently co-CEO of the Jacobs Foundation, where he shares the responsibility for the overall success of the organization. Before that, he was already at the Jacobs Foundation, head of international programs, working across Africa and Latin America, and implementing a large transformative education program for the cocoa industry. We had a cocoa farmer earlier in the conference today. That would have been interesting, but so chocolate seems to be a theme that runs through the day, and a very interesting one, not only because we all love the product, but also because it is, of course, full of challenges and things that we need to address from a corporate responsibility and from a sustainability aspect. Before, he worked at LGT Venture Philanthropy, an impact investing venture philanthropy organization that is coming out of one of the larger banks, a Swiss bank, a Liechtenstein-based bank and asset manager. And to continue with what I mentioned, a purpose-driven leader, he has worked in peace and development in Colombia, where he's originally from, and worked at that time also with the United Nations. He has been educated in Colombia and at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And on top of that, he's an honoree of the Outstanding Young Persons of the World Award. So we are very happy to have you here today. I am delighted to spend the next hour with you. And because you have much more interesting things to say than me, I would like to hand over to you, Fabio. A very warm welcome. And please share with us a little bit about what the Jacobs Foundation does, what you do in the Jacobs Foundation, and how that relates to purpose-driven businesses.
Thank you, Ernst, and good afternoon to you all. It's an honor to be here and to build up on that friendship of 12 plus years. One shouldn't speak too much about the time since we last met, because then that only makes us wish that we were in person sitting together. But this is the next best for a human management conference and humanistic management conference. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to share with you some of the motivations and big ideas that drive us and that fuels our passion here at Jacobs Foundation. And then we'll start diving into the topic of what is a business or what is an investment if no social, which I felt very intrigued by when you shared that with me, Ernst. So thank you for my introduction. I will then introduce the Jacobs Foundation. We have been active in philanthropy for a little bit over 30 years now. We were created in 1989, initially with the mission to support science, and science that would advance what we understand and know about child and youth development. Our founder was a big believer in the power of youth, and that's why our byline is our promise to youth. So we started by funding research on scientific studies, and we felt that if we did that, if we just supported what is the most rigorous way of finding out what works and for whom, decisions by different stakeholders like policymakers or entrepreneurs would be easier and they would just adopt science. But we were far from reality. A lot of the great science sits in libraries and in articles that are not accessible or not used. And so a bit later, about 20 years later, then we decided to do programs based on that science ourselves and prove that it could be possible to translate from academia to reality. And so we created the international programs. And as many foundations and charitable organizations around the world, we were at one point spread out very thinly. So we were in many countries with very different levels of engagement, with very different types of programs. And in our last review of our actual programs, we decided to close a lot of the fronts that were too small for us to create a difference, or too far away from a topic for us to create a competence, and focus in one country. And we did that from 2015 till 2020. We worked in Côte d'Ivoire in our international programs. We continue to support science globally and followed in that arm whatever rigor evidence was being created for child and youth development. But programmatically, we decided to be in Côte d'Ivoire. And coming back to the chocolate story, we decided to work alongside and with the cocoa and chocolate industry, as well as with the government of Côte d'Ivoire, with the aim to do education quality. And so that journey basically was a 5-year journey that we're celebrating next month when we publish a report of what happened in detail there. But to give you a summary, we were able to partner with 15 multinational and large cocoa and chocolate industry leaders, with 4 ministries in Côte d'Ivoire, with 3 philanthropies, including the Jacobs Foundation, the UBS Optimus Foundation, and the Bernard van Leer Foundation, and with a number of multilateral investment parties for the same purpose, tackling the quality education issue on one hand, and on the other hand, by doing this, eradicating child labor in cocoa. And so the program we have conducted led to the largest partnership for quality education ever to have been agreed upon at a national country. And right now we're ready to just roll out all of the pilots that we have tested, all of the science that we have created, also locally, and all of the force that comes at the intersection of business, policy, and philanthropy. So I will leave you with that. We have much more in store for our 2030 strategy, but I think this is a good start for a conversation, dear Ernst. We cannot hear you. If you're saying something right now, you're on mute.
It has to happen once or twice over 3 days that I forget to unmute myself. So thanks, Fabio. I mean, you mentioned what is probably can be labeled a multi-stakeholder approach in your work in Côte d'Ivoire, working with governments, working with schools, working with cocoa farmers, working with the buyers probably also. Now, what was the initial reception, and has any of the perceptions changed when you came in saying we're going to do a large-scale program on educating cocoa farmers, their children, on raising the level of education in a cocoa growing area? What were the reactions you initially received? What were challenges that you overcame?
That's very interesting. You know, when we talk about quality education as one of the sustainable development goals, right? One would believe that this is a shared value across all stakeholders and across all regions of the world. But in some parts of the world, the actual basic needs of the system are so dire that, you know, one of the first reactions we got from several stakeholders, government included, was, well, if we don't have enough schools and enough children in those schools, what quality of education can you raise? There is no education to begin with. You don't have the basis for raising the quality. And so the argument goes, we first have to get students and learners, children into schools, and then we can concern ourselves with the quality issue. And one of the discoveries we made early on is when we looked at the 10-year education plan of the country, there was not a single indicator related to actual quality, what happens within those schools. And there were many indicators related to how the system should work, how many schools were needed, where the infrastructure was needed, and so on. So I think, you know, our first battle was to put quality of education on the agenda of the government on one hand, but on the other hand, if you go and talk to a company whose business is to trade a commodity or to build a factory that actually transforms that commodity and adds value by doing so, about the impact of student learning outcomes, especially in early days on their business, that is a completely different story. And it is an even harder case to make. So the policy case and the business case were some of the first challenges we had to engage in. And how did we make that business case? We had to find in the industry, in the cocoa and chocolate industry, what was material to businesses that actually related to their value proposition and to their core business that could be only achieved with higher levels of quality of education. And on the other hand, we had to identify a few risks for the business that were very material in the sustainability of cocoa and chocolate that can be addressed best by increasing quality of education. And only 6 years down the road, with many experiments, payments by results, taking small steps and then bringing them to some level of scale, evaluating thousands of models that could actually serve at the intersection of these different stakeholders, and actually building and brokering trust between the parties, we have now the signed agreements that will allow us to do the work for the next 10 years.
Fantastic. I'm deviating a bit from what the plan was, but I have to ask this because I'm genuinely curious, and I think it's a relevant point. When we're talking about impact finance, and when I'm teaching impact investing, I'm asking students then to develop a case, an investment proposal for a social enterprise, and frequently they come up with educational programs with private schools, basically. And I'm never quite sure to what degree that is a double-edged sword, because on one side, yes, it raises the quality of education. It is probably better to have a private school than no school, but shouldn't the ultimate goal be to have a functioning public sector that is equal access for everyone, and rather than building parallel systems of a private sector education and a public sector education? What are your views on that, and how do you handle that question of should primary schooling be a private venture, or should we not focus on raising the public capacity to deliver it?
Right. So to begin with, we believe that both are necessary, and that's why we work primarily with the public school systems to try and see whether those policies and the implementation of that education is based on science available. But on the other hand, if we look at the realities of the developing world, you're most likely to attend private school if you're an Indian citizen than if you are a British citizen. In Cote d'Ivoire, in Abidjan's in Cote d'Ivoire capital Abidjan, 50% of primary school learners are attending a non-state education. So that is a very high level of students who are in private schools, and not necessarily, one tends to think of private school like a very high quality, very expensive, very exclusive education, but this is not necessarily the case. You know, these are low fees schools, oftentimes lacking the means themselves to have adequate teachers and adequate materials and adequate pedagogy and so on. So we need to also work with that system to raise the bar there as well. Now, we also work with the high-end schools of the world, and we have several partnerships with different chains and aggregators, we call them, of high-income schools. And why do we do that? Because the process is to test things there like technologies or pedagogies in a safe manner, and therefore create public goods is perhaps more efficient than if you have to go through the whole process of doing so in the public system. And we are strong believers that the private school system can be mobilized as any private sector, going back to business, being social, to create value that goes beyond the shareholders or the direct beneficiaries or customers. And that's the bet we're taking here.
Yes, very much so, I think. And now when we're looking at the private sector, at the buyers, at the commodity traders, at factory owners, all that supply chain in the cocoa industry and beyond, do you see a change in their self-perception? Do you see a movement in industries? Because we experience that in the B2C areas, right? The closer businesses are to consumers, the more they are now having their purpose statements on the websites, and they're having their sustainability chain activities, and they're communicating how they contribute to the SDGs. And but is that going all the way through to B2B businesses that are, unless there is something happening that gets public attention and that causes a shitstorm on social media and so forth, oftentimes B2B businesses are not that much in our daily presence. And,
right.
Does that play a role, or are they moving just as much as consumer-facing industries?
Well, there are different answers to that, but I will start with a quote that I very much enjoy that says, if people lead, the leaders will follow. And so the power of individuals to inform themselves and demand that businesses deliver on social value cannot be undermined. And this begins by a few journalists pointing out at an issue that a business or an industry is dealing with, and putting that in the public, and the public asking questions about it. And it goes down all the way to regulation, to those concerns being reflected in regulation. So in the last few years of work in this particular industry, we have seen all of it happening. Number one, there are very committed individuals within very large companies or very large conglomerates who are truly committed to creating positive value for their full range of stakeholders, including the people they're sourcing from. And those are our first allies in this journey. So getting to work with them and empowering their internal conversations has been one of the first things that we have addressed. Then there are people that are ultimate consumers to their products down in the supply chain, when, as you say, one cannot even see anymore who has been party to that transaction and who is accountable, who started asking questions louder and louder, and therefore media attention followed, and ultimately regulation followed. And so one of the things that we're seeing in Europe, for example, is that consuming countries are now considering and advancing very fast on human rights due diligence approaches to the supply chain of the companies that are allowed to import, for example, to the European Union or to the United States or to specific countries. One of the favorite stories that I have to share with you is the story of a particular company. I'm going to break rule here and praise them for how they have managed this, which was Tony Chocolondi's. Basically, their founder went to a court in the Netherlands and said to the judge, I just ate this bar of chocolate. I have just contributed to child labor. Please, process me. And so nobody took him seriously until he went back to Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana, I can't remember which were the two countries, and gather a few victims of child labor and says, now you come with me and you sue me before this court. So therefore, the legal basis for an actual case completely changed. Again, he didn't go to prison, but the way in which they, by doing this, raise the awareness that we all play a role as customers. Being informed, being aware, and demanding changes is critical. But they did something even more critical, which is they created Tony Chocolondi's, the company, to actually prove to business that you can actually conduct a business with commitment to creating a change in a social area like child labor and still be profitable. And that's what they do. They have tried to approach this from several angles. They recognize when they identify themselves cases of child labor, and they have also recognized and demonstrated that a growing business can actually be profitable, grow, and do so in a value-based manner. So this is a great example of many I could quote from one of our 15 companies that to a lesser or greater extent do transformation out there. And the last thing I will prove of change here, when we did a survey back in 2015 to see where companies were where quality of education was in the agendas of sustainability of the companies, we found that no single of our partners had a explicit mention of quality education, or let alone a strategy for increasing it in Cote d'Ivoire. Today, because of the mechanisms we have agreed with them, this has been a precondition for us to continue conversations. You now will monitor it, you will have specific indicators to that, and you will include it in your reports that actually make you accountable to your shareholders and larger stakeholders. And you will see how this can be improved over time.
Thank you very much. I want to pick up two things there. I mean, firstly, you said we can be a growing company and be profitable and do create good impact. I just want to share that I remember talking on a panel, I think it was once, with someone from Natura, a very purpose-driven, sustainable cosmetics company from Brazil. And they said, listen, yes, of course we want to grow, because the more we grow, the more positive impact we grow as well. So the problem with growth is that you grow both. You grow your adverse impact and you grow your positive impact. But if you have a positive impact on your communities, growth is fantastic, because you grow, the more you grow, the more you can contribute to communities, the more you can protect the environment. So really, if you are making a positive contribution, growth is welcomed, and that's what we should want for those organizations. But secondly, I wanted to ask you on regulation, because you mentioned the legal case, which is essentially framed around legal environments and regulation. And the question there is, you know, that we often hear from businesses, we don't need regulation. Regulation is a red flag, right? They say we have our compliance rules, we are having our self-regulating mechanisms, and we're adhering to them unconditionally, so we don't need regulation, no need for that, because we're doing it anyways. Now, I always wonder, like, if that is the case, if you're doing it anyways, why are you not wanting that to be regulated? Because essentially it creates a competitive advantage for you. It raises the bar to a higher level. It creates a level playing field for those who are already doing more than the current regulation. So shouldn't they advocate, shouldn't they lobby for stricter regulation? What is your experience in this, you know, red flag characteristic of regulation? The moment that term comes up, you know, all kind of alarm signals go off with private sector organizations.
I will make two comments. One which actually puts us a little bit in the direction of what is a business if not social, right? For many years now, one can even talk about 1.5 decades here in Europe, impact investors have made the assumption that if a business core values is to create positive impact, then the impact will grow alongside with the business. I have challenged that assumption very greatly, because as you rightly say, one has to manage business as one has to manage impact as a line of business in order for it to grow, because, you know, any other variable will not necessarily grow with the size of your business. Think of costs. You manage costs down and you manage economies of scale, but it's not an automatic effect. You manage for that very proactively, and then you spend a lot of time thinking about how to make capital more efficient, or a production operation higher in quality or faster. However, impact is not something that just grows, and it also does not happen in what is so-called social businesses, and that's just a premise that we can come back to later. Role of regulation, I fully agree with you. Regulation oftentimes comes at a later stage of awareness of a community. Regulation does not necessarily reflect the pedagogical tool we have to learn about what the community needs, but quite the opposite. It reflects what we have agreed upon is the general direction we're going, as well as, you know, if you think of jails, they don't represent the full code of a civil code of any country. They represent what that country really wants to punish. And so there are many things in that code that actually do not have people in jail that should be. Now, in that sense, regulation tends to be compliance, and compliance is nothing but the floor, it's the very basic of what this community, this society agrees a business should be doing, or an individual for that matter should be doing or not doing. But from there on, the ambition level of truly valuable businesses has to go much further. So the ceiling that stands high above that floor can be set by individuals that are, and companies and organizations, translating that ambition level into their business essentials or basics. And that, I think, is something that should drive further regulation. It should inform society, and it should give opportunities for greater value creation. And I am fully with you. Those who truly do it actually tend to do better business, also from a financial and shareholder perspective.
Yeah. You're mentioning a financial perspective. So let's go to something that is very close to your daily activities, I would assume. The changes in social finance, the changes in providing impact capital, because clearly, I mean, you know, social enterprises, be they startups or be they big, or also large established businesses that are undergoing a transformation towards creating more positive impact, all businesses need finance. And so we started, you know, in the 1982, if I'm right, the Green Bank was founded. So this is not something super new anymore. So there is an evolution in impact finance also. How would you say, what are the current trends? What are shifts, changes in providing capital to organizations in different stages of their organizational life cycle, providing capital for those organizations? How has it changed? What do we now know that we didn't before? Where's the focus?
That's a very fascinating journey. I mean, going back to Grameen Bank, right? If one reads Professor Yunus's early work on towards the world without poverty and the history of the Grameen Bank, one feels that his main motivation at the start was to, in fact, provide an opportunity for those small businesses who just require some working capital in a way that would break them away from the sharp loans. And you know, by creating the bank, he basically institutionalized that that loan, that capital provision given. And today, still, Grameen Bank is a for-profit institution that actually has managed to turn around the concept of not trusting the poor, not trusting those who are in most need, and in fact proved at many points that their ability to repay was higher than the ability of other income levels to honor their own loans. However, I think that in the meantime, we have unveiled many layers of what is called social finance or impact finance. You know, by starting by putting capital in social businesses that will grow and that would serve a community value need, we have then turned into different subsegments of that industry. You have microfinance, you have private equity or venture capital type of support, and then you have blended finance. Now, one of the realizations is that the assumption was there that if a business would try to create positive impact, for example, on education or on social housing, the growth of that business would result in higher impact. But we also learned that very largely we were making uninformed choices. So what we created, what we called impact in our frameworks for many years, has been something like a collection of speculation or speculative assumptions with good intentions that didn't really change the needle in the systems in which those businesses were incubated. To give examples, today, not to go too far in time, we have educational technologies being more broadly used than at any given point in the history of humanity. Just in this year, in the first 3 quarters of the year, there were over 16 billion invested in EdTech globally, more than any year already in the first 3 quarters. However, how many of us here who are using a technology know which EdTech is more educational than others? How many of these EdTech technologies have been actually tested for effectiveness and actually can prove that the results of their learners being engaging with them is actually coming from a causal link between their technology and the result? Less than 5% have even been tested for effectiveness. So we have the largest experiment humanity has ever gone into. We are assuming that EdTech or technology in education is a good thing because it will help us solve a number of problems, but we're not really sure of what is actually resolving the problem. One of our investees, and we have a few in our portfolio, basically used to claim our users are 30% better than their counterparties. So people who don't use our technology in this domain or this test. And when we looked closer, what was happening there is that their parents were not only buying that technology, they were buying books, they were literate themselves at home, they had a higher socioeconomic status, they were spending time with the children. So they're spending time with the children and the books at home were actually the one thing changing that difference. So science hasn't been so much at the center of impact. And I do believe that what has changed in between is that we have unveiled the emperor, and we need to be more serious about what we call impact and what about the causal links between the business activities and the situations we want to transform. And the second thing I think is important here is, as impact investors, we many times stayed at the company level of things. Meaning by that, we had in our hypothesis to support a business, a social business, to support it with capital, with knowledge, with access to networks, and some form of expertise of the industry. And we felt that if we did that, we could change the entire realities of the problems that were out there to tackle. But what is short-sighted in this vision is that in order for that business to successfully do that, there are so many things outside of that company, in the public goods domain, in the infrastructure, in the regulation, in the ecosystem, that actually could not be tackled by a single company. So oftentimes our provision of capital to specific organizations falls short of the need of capital to actually address things that go beyond business per se, and that really attack the systemic underlying causes of those situations. And that's where we have changed a lot, where the new models I would expect will call for more evidence-based solutions on one hand, but on the other one for more true collaboration between public and private capital that addresses a broader spectrum of needs than those of a company.
All right, thanks very much. I'll do something now that is difficult for me, which is to not ask any more questions of my own, but to go to the chat and check the questions that we have, because there are plenty. And Marcus was the first to ask, what are the mission of your foundation, of the Jacobs Foundation, and is there an explicit mentioning of values, of humanistic values, and how do you put those in practice? And the second part of the question would be, what can the contribution be of an organization like the Humanistic Management Network, a research-driven, sustainability-oriented organization that wants to use business in a more productive way for a more sustainable and more equitable planet? What can the role of an organization like ours be?
Well, those are big questions. I'll start with the mission of the Jacobs Foundation. Our mission that we adopted in 1989 is still valid today, and it is to empower the future generations to become active and valuable members of society. So we're not saying we're an education foundation or we're a research foundation. This ultimate humanistic value allows us to change with times and adopt the course in the current strategy that allows us to have that concept of empowerment be translated into the future generations. And the current interpretation we have given of that is to make education variability a value for the different systems. In other words, how do we ensure that governments and that schools and that classes around the world are catering to individuals rather than to groups? Because education hasn't changed much in the last few hundred years, and the world has. And then the last part there is, how do we then take this now to a global community of learners, and what legitimacy do we have to empower them to deal with problems we don't even know exist yet, or with future challenges we don't even predict so far, that actually makes us legitimate in being competent in choosing what kind of pedagogy, what kind of content, and what kind of schools we're building for the future generations. So that's how we're looking at it from a mission perspective, and how we tend to translate it in our current strategy.
Good. If we're looking, moving on, Miriam is asking, thanks for your inspiring approach. What could we learn from your initiative for other industries and countries that are still lacking quality education and income? So, in essence, what are the transferable knowledge or experiences that you've gained, or is it an illusion that we can just roll out a one-size-fits-all model? What is replicable?
One of the things we started, as I said, by closing all of our activities in many countries and focusing only on one in Côte d'Ivoire, and that was in the period 2015 to 2020. In the current period that started this year, we're now taking the lessons learned from Côte d'Ivoire and how we've worked there to other 4 countries. And those 4 countries will include Ghana, which we started operations in right now. They will include Switzerland, where we're staying right now, and a country yet to be chosen in Latin America, which will be either Colombia or Brazil. Now, what we're taking from that is 2 basic lessons learned. Number 1, the case for policy and the case for business needs to be erected on the basis of rigorous evidence and science. So we have to enter in this context agnostic of any model. We're not promoting any particular model. We're evaluating the needs of the country where we're present, or the needs of the systems that we want to support. And then we're looking at what are the models out there that are effectively addressing that need. Number 2 is no single stakeholder, and particularly that is true today, including the government, can address the challenges to doing that transformation. No particular stakeholder can do it, but all stakeholders will benefit from doing it. So we need to also create the case for a partnership. That's the second part. And then obviously for the catalytic investments that will need to be put together by the different stakeholders. But lastly, the windows of opportunities that policy offers need to be taken and materialized, because all of these will be only projects if the system itself is not shifting. So we take a lot of time to studying when is policy really made? Where are windows to permeate what actually ends up being adopted as a national program that is funded and maintained over time, and therefore shifting mindsets. And those are important elements to consider. Now, I'm talking about big programs, big countries, big budgets. But what we did in parallel, and we started this year with that, was to go to the school, to the actual classroom, and take that as a unit of impact. And we said, you know, as Jacobs Foundation, we want to give ourselves the ambition level to interact with 10% of the world's schools, some 500,000. Nobody really knows how many schools there are today. But why cannot we go to the school level and engage with that teacher who has an idea in her day-to-day work of what could be done differently, if only she had a little bit of support or a little bit of capital to experiment? Why can we not go to that teacher association in a country trying to give visibility to what they believe are best practices, or to that parent or to that student who have managed to create a very concrete example of something that can be done differently in the system that could be inspiring changes? Or on the other hand, why can we not take some of the questions they are asking themselves, what if? Because science is born out of these questions if done rigorously and studied concretely. And why can we not elevate to science some of these questions at the school level? So what I've seen that is extremely empowering and exciting is that in the most dire contexts, in the most resource-strained contexts, there are people with creativity tackling the very challenges that make up the basis of the science of learning, because they are in connection with learning, because they understand what it means, and primarily because they care about learning as an actual objective of education.
Fantastic. So Sonia is asking, in your educational activities, do you engage with parents and family, and if so, how?
We do. Here in Switzerland, we were famous in our previous strategy for managing the whole policy of ECD, early childhood development. And we have gained a lot of understanding about how parents, the government, and institutional and non-institutional education works in the early years. In Côte d'Ivoire, to talk about a different context, we were able to plug into a national nutrition program a parenting component, and that is working with parents so that we can actually have parents doing the most basic things in the early years that would actually require little effort and yield a lot of returns in terms of developmental outcomes of children. I'll give you a few examples. Many cultures don't value talking to children because they don't believe this is yet a valuable use of time. But talking to children is one of the most important things you have to do in the first 1,000 days of life. Exclusive breastfeeding. Many cultures believe that if you start with a diversified diet or even with water in the early days, that's better. But science has told us that there is such benefits to exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months of life. Playing, looking at the eyes, singing, reading out loud, and so on, are simple parental behaviors one can engage in a whole nation and have concrete, significant developmental outcomes on further academic performance and on health and nutrition. And so that's the way that we're working with parents. And we again work with the cocoa and chocolate industry quite a lot in that country, because what for us is parents, for them is farmers or members of their society. So we have a common interest in their well-being in the long term.
Yeah, very, very good. Now Shin is asking a very intriguing question, I find. He's basically asking how do you define quality education? what is quality. And he adds to that that in the Indian context, where he's leading our Humanistic Management India chapter, the observation is that quite a lot of very successful leaders in private sector organizations actually come from what is labeled low cost, not exactly high quality, public educational organizations. And that goes from primary schooling to universities. So the results in terms of developing responsible leaders are hard to determine by what we generally apply or what our gut feel would be of what a quality education means. So how do you define quality in education?
I will use an Indian reference point because if this is the reality, at the same time, India has contributed to the world one of the most effective quality education models we know today. So Pratham, who the NGO who just won the prize, the EDAM prize for best practice, has also been recognized indirectly by the 2019 Nobel Laureate Prize. Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, who basically contributed heavily to the development of this practice, were awarded the Nobel Laureate. And what does it consist of? What is quality education in that view of the world? Number one, the teachers have to be trained in accordance to the needs of the students. So it's a student or learner-centered model, and it is an adaptive teaching model. Number two, you have a school that is protective. You have a community that is engaged in students. You have content that is relevant. And lastly, you have objectives that go beyond purely learning outcomes. But what's really truly innovative about the teaching at the right level is what the model is called, is that they were able to challenge the way the world organizes education. As you all know from direct experiences, one enters a certain age and one moves like in a conveyor belt from one grade to the next with a group of people who are in the same age. However, learning happens differently in each of these individuals. And what Pratham has done with this teaching at the right level is take the students for an hour or 2 hours in a period of 1 week and reorganize them from that time. Instead of putting them by age or by grade, arrange them by the ability to conduct certain exercises. So those who are a bit underperforming in math will be with others who are underperforming, and those who are performing better will be with peers in that level. And then the teacher will teach to them and they will meet them at that level, at the right level. And this has proven to be, by many objective evaluations, the best form to completely disrupt education, but increase quality by very significant standard deviation points on test results. And it doesn't require a whole revamping of the infrastructure or teacher training or any of that. So it's one of the most cost-effective ways to increasing quality of education. So I just wanted to mention that this is one of the models I'm a big fan of, and also with all of the challenges that we have in India, we have great models and great science to be proud of.
And Shiv is just writing, thanks for the insights. So your answer has been well taken. We have it's not so much a question, but I'll turn it into a question from Dorothee, who says family businesses are inspiring role models as well. So if we're looking at the bigger picture of what is business if not social, do you think the sort of the legal setup of an organization matters? Do you find that family businesses, privately held businesses act differently than listed companies? Do you think smaller companies that are, having a local clientele act differently than corporate organizations that are global? Or would it be too simple to just say, a small family business is good and a large global corporate is not?
I think the bigger difference is in the size, maturity, and legal form of a business is what are the feedback loops that the people or person running the business has to understand what demands the broader range of stakeholders are putting on that business. I'll be concrete. In a publicly listed corporation, you have a very visible set of indicators and figures you have to post to the public on a yearly basis. And you have a very broad constituency of shareholders that have different interests and ways of voicing this formally, that a small business in a small town in South Colombia will probably not be exposed to. So a family business in a southern city of or town of Leticia in Colombia would probably not be exposed to all of that. Now, in terms of the business per se, what is a business if not social? A business was created to generate value, and to generate value in a way that revenues at the end of the day or at the end of the period are higher than your cost of doing so, which makes it a business. Otherwise, it is a different form of organization. Now, do social businesses differ from for-profit, purely for-profit business? Well, the difference here is that in the business model canvas, if you take all of these big blocks, right, what is a value proposition, what are your customers, how do you deliver that? A social business, and it could be a for-profit multinational company, thinks about generating value for the full stakeholder array at all of these blocks. And a business that is not socially driven does not. So there's a disconnect there. But the distinction between social business and for-profit business almost justifies that every other business that is not labeled social business can destroy the planet and the ecosystem and the value they're creating for society, whereas the social businesses ones are there to save the planet and the world. And I believe that no longer is true. Basically, societies around the world are raising the bar of what we expect out of the corporations and the products we consume. And the more we're informed and the more we're organized about our demands, even those smaller businesses that are less transparent will be subject to new regulation and to new clients with voting with their wallets and with their feet on the products and services we're consuming.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo that. I remember it's quite a while ago, I was in Zurich at a social entrepreneurship award, it was, and it was hosted by a traditional large business. And in the opening keynote, a representative of the organization was telling about all the good things that social entrepreneurs do, you know, how they develop products that are meaningful for people, that they are doing this without harming the environment, that they are contributing to the development of their communities, and so forth. And I was just sitting there wondering, all right, but what does that mean for the rest of business? You know, do they not contribute to the communities? Do they not develop products that are meaningful to people? And if they don't, what is their legitimacy? Why do we want them? Why do they exist even if they don't? So I think that perfectly resonates with the fact that, you know, in a sense, any business has to learn and turn into some level of social enterprise. Because on one side, I think it would be simply wrong to expect a small portion of, you know, a minute fraction of entrepreneurs that are so labeled social enterprises to fix it for the rest of us so that we don't have to do anything. And it would simply be unrealistic in expecting that can happen. Because let's face it, if a large corporate changes the material of the packaging of their ice cream, let's say, the environmental impact is probably bigger than what all social or environmentally driven organizations have collectively, right? So we need transformation at all levels of entrepreneurial activities. I think that is something we need to be aware of. We can't expect this small portion of organizations that are labeled or that are self-labeling themselves as social enterprises to say like, okay, now we've got this small sub-segment of our economy and they'll fix it for us. That would not be an expectation that is right, and it's not an expectation that's realistic.
And that has two consequences, Ernst. The first one is we cannot undermine the positive effect that a committed, established large business can have on society if a group of people, be it their management, their shareholders, or the customers, move them in that direction. Because oftentimes we're struggling to scale what we call social business with a lot of capital, with a lot of mentoring and so on. And there are not many organizations out there that have IPO'd coming from a social business perspective, that are not reaching the problems at the scale that we're experiencing them. Whereas these more established mainstream businesses, if they adopt a social value as an outcome also to be pursued alongside profits, can be very powerful. But the second one is that It is up to the few out there who are thinking about the changes needed in business, in management, and in frameworks to come up with credible, viable, and creative ways of making business cases for those companies in the mainstream and the bulk of the economy to start shifting faster and attending to the broader value creation purpose they were incepted for.
Absolutely. So yes, there's one more question here, which is on both business and education, I guess, which is asking for the future of EdTech. I mean, what are your notion there? I mean, those are in the educational sector, but the bulk of it are private initiatives, so they're operating or set up as a business organization. Will it revolutionize the way we learn, or you know, what are the trends and what is your perspective on EdTech?
Not wanting to speculate too much, I mean, but let's just look at what's happening today. We have, as I mentioned earlier, the statistics, 16 billion invested only this year in EdTech, and today, this year, that constitutes less than 6% of all total spending in education. So one can actually imagine that EdTech as a solution, as a way of conducting the business of learning, will only grow exponentially in the years to come. And that poses opportunities as well as challenges. I mentioned earlier that there are very few parts of the world that are actually producing EdTech. In the Silicon Valley, some parts of Europe, and it's been exported largely around different regions, right? That comes with less diverse learners in EdTech than we have in schools. That comes with less diverse set of languages today in EdTech that we have in schools around the world. And that comes with less available EdTech, high quality EdTech today than we have schools. So price point is an issue, technology availability is an issue, and context is an issue. So how are we at Jacobs Foundation seeing this opportunity? We decided to invest with our programmatic philanthropic capital in 9 EdTech focused VC funds, venture capital funds. So we basically said, we're going to take parts, we're going to invest, we're going to become an LP in your fund. And in order for us to do that, we want you to do a number of things. Number one, that you connect your portfolio companies to our network of researchers, so that they can actually marry science and what works with product development. Number two, that you commit to looking at your pipeline in a broader sense and also serving populations that today do not have access or for whom there's no solutions being developed in EdTech. And number three, that we use all of this joint learning to elevate the bar of what due diligence and investment processes and post-investment management is in the industry. So we have just placed a large amount of capital in doing that bet, and we feel that we will achieve some of these with more success in some cases than others, but in turn, we will use all of the proceeds from that investment to fund further science in education. And again, this is a case of us being extremely creative, about addressing a challenge that we see that populations receiving the EdTech products is not in a position to address.
Right. We have time for, I guess, one more question or two. I'll see what's coming there. The question would be, what should we as a network demand as priority number one, and how? So you mentioned the guy with the chocolate bar saying, sue me. I don't know, I'm probably surrounded.
I do not recommend you do this experiment.
If I'm looking around here from my beamer to the laptop to the sofa I'm sitting on, there will probably be lots of products I'm using every day where if I would do my research, I could not be sure that this is produced fairly and sustainably. But going beyond, you know, the personal thing, what as a network, what can we demand and ask for from whom?
Well, you know, when there's a saying in Spanish that goes, if we are not many, we must be enough, right? So imagine the implications of that. You know, any network is limited by definition, and your ambition might be much higher than your ability to directly do something. So you have to be enough, meaning by that, you have to raise up to the challenge. There are a few things that we can do if you have very limited resources, as any network would do. And number one is to take the committed capital that is there for the good, for the creation of social value, and hold it up to accountability under promise. One easy way to do that is asking what is the evidence and the science behind your assumptions. Because in philanthropy and in impact investing, still today, there's a lot of money that is being poured into solutions that simply don't work. And we're past that paradigm. So we need to just ask for more evidence being used by philanthropies, by investors, and by social enterprises. That's a simple one. Science is there. If investing in science is too expensive, the amount of science that has already been invested in that is not used is vast. Number two, try and partner with those who you find uncomfortable to partner with. So the other side of the equation, the non-converted, because there's another whole lot of capital there that actually is facing very serious, very material challenges to their business. Nothing that is unsustainable is actually profitable in the long term for business either. So try to resolve via this marrying of creative cases the problems that business is experiencing, and let us not be scared of them making a profit on that. Because if they actually resolve a major business problem that in fact is also a societal problem, then we have business being social, even if they're established companies. And lastly, let us design organizations that are able to collaborate on learning agendas. Because if we do all of that, but do not elevate that to our consciousness level, then the future generations will not have a basis to build better solutions as we go. So let's be in love with the problems that we're trying to tackle, and let's ask ourselves that question over and over again to really see what we pin down as lessons learned from that journey.
Thanks a lot, Fabio. Towards the end, I want to make it personal and ask you in a very individual and Fabio answering what drives you. Why are you doing this? I mean, you could probably have a life that is more comfortable, that involves less travel to volatile regions. And you chose a career path that is very admirable, but what drives you in doing so?
Well, thanks for making that observation. I began my career in a southern little village in Colombia, and I began by observing how my country had dealt with its differences in such a violent manner, and understood the basics of conflict being us not being able to address the actual differences in the contradictions that led us to that conflict. And I promised myself that I would try and find answers to what could be done in a way that we can actually have a higher quality of life and actually deliver a better planet to our next generations than we have been handed. So all of what I have been working on since then, from conflict and peace work to sustainability, to impact investing, and to foundation work, is trying to answer a question of what would I do when I go back to my hometown and try to create that impact at the local level. And in the process, what happened, which wasn't intentional, is that I started adopting new towns and new countries. And today I'm also being adopted Switzerland, where my children are growing up and living, as a country where I also want to leave something behind. So I guess it's a passion for what is possible and hasn't yet been done.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, Fabio. Thank you for sharing your experiences, your knowledge, your insights with us. And I want to just share with everyone that I had thought that maybe we'll go in a breakout room, but time just flew. So we were very happy to have you here for this hour. Thanks a lot once again. And I want to close this session with a saying that a friend of mine taught me in Tübingen, who said, what we need to understand is that business is when people work together with people to create value for people. And with that, I want to close this session. Thank you very much, Fabio, again, and hand over to Wolfgang, who will announce our next speaker that we're all very anxiously waiting for. Thank you, Fabio. Welcome, Wolfgang, and I'm much looking forward to the next session.